All right, welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are digging into a pretty provocative analysis, one that paints a really startling picture of what a hypothetical war between the US and Iran could look like. We're going to walk through the specific claims made in this one source to really get a handle on its very dark forecast.
So, let's jump right in. The source material we're looking at lays out a pretty grim forecast, basically suggesting that this conflict is not going well for the US and its allies. But to even begin to understand why, we have to rewind a bit and look at how, according to this analysis, diplomacy just completely fell apart.
Yeah, the whole analysis kicks off with this idea of a total breakdown in communication. The source argues that, from Iran's point of view, a good faith negotiation, it just wasn't even a possibility.
So the takeaway here is that Iran, according to this source, just concluded the talks were pointless. But why? Well, the analysis points a finger directly at the specific peoples sitting on the other side of the negotiating table.
Okay, this is where it gets really interesting, because you can see how the source frames this whole diplomatic stalemate. On one side, you have the US team, who are described as having these really strong ideological motives. And on the other side, you've got what the source calls Iran's non-negotiable red lines, things like keeping their missile program for their own defense.
And wow, the language the source uses here is incredibly blunt. It paints a picture of the US negotiators as not just ideologically driven, but also incompetent. It even tells this story, and we gotta stress this is just one side's claim, where a US official supposedly makes these really basic mistakes. And this leads the Iranian side to just dismiss him as, and I'm quoting the source here, an idiot. This whole idea of incompetence is absolutely central to the source's argument for why these talks were doomed from the start.
So what's the bottom line? According to this analysis, that complete breakdown at the negotiating table leads directly, and I mean directly, to the battlefield. The source concludes that Iran was basically pushed into a corner where they believed the only language the other side would understand was force.
All right, let's shift gears now and move to the battlefield itself, because this is where things really start to escalate. The source argues that the military strategy being used by the US and Israel, well, it's just not working the way they thought it would.
And this really is the central question, right? If the US has such overwhelming military superiority, why does this source claim the war is going so badly for them? The answer, it suggests, is that Iran is using a really effective asymmetric strategy to counter all that firepower.
The analysis then starts listing off these specific events, like successful strikes on major infrastructure targets. It holds these up as proof that Iran can inflict real, significant economic and military pain. And the argument is that US leadership was just completely caught off guard, totally shocked by Iran's ability to not just meet them, but to keep raising the stakes in this conflict.
And then there's the human cost, which is just immense. The source highlights this staggering figure, reportedly from the Iranian Committee on the Red Cross, claiming that over 17,000 residential buildings have been damaged or completely destroyed.
So here's the core argument from this analysis, laid out pretty clearly. It's saying that US and Israeli strikes are mostly hitting things like outdated naval ships and old Air Force assets, stuff that wasn't that useful anyway. Meanwhile, Iran's core capabilities, like its really effective Shahed drone program and its ballistic missile program, are pretty much still intact. And what does that mean? It means, according to the source, that Iran is basically ready for a long, drawn-out war of attrition.
Okay, this is where the analysis takes a really strange turn. We're moving from the battlefield to the psychological dimension, looking at how this war is supposedly being perceived from inside the White House. And here it is, maybe the most speculative and frankly bizarre claim in the entire analysis. The source alleges this wild scenario, that to keep President Trump on board with the war, a faction inside the administration is telling him that all the videos showing US losses are fakes. Not just fakes, but sophisticated AI-generated fakes.
The source then presents a bunch of other alleged events as evidence that the administration is in full-on panic mode. It paints this picture of a leadership that's totally detached from what's actually happening on the ground, lashing out at the press for cheering for his failure, and all the while being fed this completely false narrative that everything is going great.
So, the really crucial point here, the big takeaway from this section of the analysis, is this idea of a leadership that's been completely insulated from the truth. They're essentially led to believe they're winning a war that, in reality, is a total disaster. It's like they're fighting in a psychological simulation. And this supposed detachment from reality, the source warns, could lead to the most catastrophic outcome you can possibly imagine.
The analysis suggests that as Israel starts to face the grim prospect of a long, unwinnable war of attrition against an enemy that just won't quit, it might, out of sheer desperation, reach for the ultimate weapon.
So this slide really lays out the source's frightening chain of logic. It goes like this. Step 1, you have an unwinnable conventional war. Step 2, that desperation could lead Israel or even the US to use a tactical nuclear weapon. And then, Step 3, the source argues that this very possibility is the ultimate justification for Iran to develop its own nuclear weapons program, framing it as a completely rational and necessary deterrent.
And to back up this pretty terrifying theory, the analysis points to a real-world event. It takes this report of a massive earthquake near Dimona, which is Israel's secret nuclear facility, and interprets it as a deliberate message, a possible secret nuclear test, basically showing the world that Israel is, in the source's own words, preparing for the worst. Look, in the end, this source presents one possible, and let's be honest, deeply troubling forecast. Now, whether you buy into all of its specific claims or not, the core warning is really powerful. It's about how easily a conflict can spiral completely out of control when diplomacy fails, when military strategies backfire, and when leaders, for whatever reason, become detached from reality. It really is a sobering look at one potential path to catastrophe.